Hey guys, how's it going? It's Leon here. Today I'm going to talk to you about the connection between the creative mind and the ADHD mind. What is the link between the two? So just to give you a bit of background here, I was an ADHD and creativity researcher, and I currently work as a psychotherapist. And one of the populations I focus on is people with ADHD. I am also a mama. I have two master's degrees, does MA, and my first master's degree was in research psychology, in which I looked at the connection between ADHD and creativity. And my second master's degree was in mental health counseling, by which I became a psychotherapist. I just want to mention too that I did a TEDx talk in the past about creativity. And if you want to check that out, I have a link to it down below in the description box. Now, before I move on, I want to let you know that I've written an article about how you could talk compassionately with yourself. And it's based on a method in psychotherapy that is really, really useful. And I've written in such a way that it's really easy to understand and comprehend how to do it. My research advisor, Dr. Bonnie Cramen, gave this really wonderful and beautiful metaphor when it came to understanding the value of people who have ADHD. So she looks at it this way, that people with ADHD are wired differently from others, but this wiring has its own value. It has its own strengths and weaknesses, and diversity in how our brains are wired is important to society. Every brain has its way of contributing. And what she compared this to is the Irish potato famine back in the 1800s, where there wasn't that much genetic diversity when it came to potatoes. And thus, that's what wiped the potatoes out. So this is why diversity is important. And when it comes to diversity of brains, we call this neurodiversity. It's coined by Judy Singer. And it was and is an important paradigm shift. So based on the medical model, there is a normal brain. And if brains differ from this so-called normal brain, they're dysfunctional and they're broken. And your goal is to try to make these brains as normal as you can. This is not a very helpful paradigm when it comes to treating others, because first of all, it does not really reflect the truth. And second of all, if you're being treated and you're told that you're completely broken and you need to be fixed, that is really detrimental to people's self-esteem, and it demotivates them on their pathway to being able to address their issues. So what neurodiversity is not saying, it's not saying that, okay, people are wired in different ways and there's nothing that you could do about it. There's no changes that people can make. It's saying that every brain wiring, including the neurotypical brain wiring, has its own strengths and weaknesses. And we could understand that you could bring out people's strengths while also helping them with their weaknesses as well. I really love this view because it gives people a context by which they could understand themselves and also be able to value themselves as well. And that's a much better place to start when it comes to motivating people to be able to address the challenges that they may have. So when it comes to neurodiversity, this term first became popular in autism online forums and later on spread to bipolar, Tourette's, and ADHD communities. An example of a well-known proponent of neurodiversity is Dr. Temple Grandin, and she's done some great work as a scientist and also as a proponent for the humane treatment of livestock. And she's also an autistic person, and she attributes her ingenuity to her autistic tendencies. She mentioned, if I could snap my fingers and be non-autistic, I would not. Autism is part of what I am. I want to mention about two famous people who may have had ADHD. One is Robert Frost, and the other one is Frank Lloyd Wright. Robert Frost is a famous poet, and Frank Lloyd Wright is a famous architect. What you may not know about them is that they were really big daydreamers in school, which corresponds with the tendency that people with ADHD have of being inattentive. In fact, Robert Frost was so inattentive in school and he daydreamed so much that he had to drop out of school because of it. And Frank Lloyd Wright himself was so intensely in his head that his uncle had to shout into his ear in order to get his attention. We could look at it this way. On one hand, we could describe them as being inattentive, which is a negative way to look at their daydreaming. On the other hand, we could also look at their inattention as diverted attention, because we could think about it this way. Perhaps Robert Frost was churning a poem in his head when he was daydreaming. Frank Lloyd Wright was probably thinking about creative ideas. So instead of looking at ADHD people as merely being distracted, there's also a flip side to the coin, that they also have diverted attention. So one thing that is an unofficial trait of ADHD people, it's very, very common among them, but it's not written down officially as a symptom, is hyperfocus. So people with ADHD often purport that they could become highly focused and attentive for a very long period of time on a singular idea or a project. And they could concentrate so hard that they even lose track of everything that's going around them. The benefit of being hyper-focused is that people with ADHD could really put a lot of attention towards working on an idea that they have. I don't want to overwrite the idea that hyperfocus may also be a weakness, but it's also important to emphasize that it is very much as well a benefit. Because when we only look at people with ADHD as having problems, that is not going to be a very helpful view. A more helpful view would be to try to find a way to hone hyperfocus and to hone diverted attention in such a way that it would benefit the person with ADHD. Unfortunately, people with ADHD are not identified or diagnosed by their positive traits. ADHD is defined primarily by its negative traits, by, for example, inattentiveness, distractibility, inability to sit still, tendency to fidget, not being able to follow directions all that well. And the reason why ADHD is identified by these negative traits is, of course, the whole point of diagnosis is to be able to identify and address what the problems are. But at the same time, I feel like this is a very limited view. And psychotherapists should also be looking at what might be the positive side of ADHD when it comes to treatment. And two examples here is hyperfocus and diverted attention. My research advisor, Dr. Bonnie Cramen, found a strong link between creativity and ADHD. 26% of creative adolescents have clinically elevated ADHD symptoms. These include the symptoms of inattention and also the symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. Symptoms of inattention includes often fails to give close attention to detail or makes mistakes, often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or activities, often does not seem to listen when directly spoken to. And symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity include often fidgets with or taps hands and feet, or squirms in seat, or often leaves seat in situation when remaining seated is expected, etc. So people with ADHD and people who are creative often have both of these kind of traits, or one or the other. Now, I want to mention about some so-called neurological abnormalities of people who have ADHD and also people who are creative. So these are neurological abnormalities that are similar between people who are ADHD and people who are creative. So the first one here is that they have a tendency to be right-brained and left-bodied. So we know that the left body is connected with the right brain, and the right brain is associated with creativity. So most people would have more of a left brain kind of tendency. And now, right now, we would know that being left brain or right brain, neither of these are worse compared to the other. That people who are right brain and people who are left brain bring in their own strengths to the table. Now, let's look at the rest of this list. When you look at the rest of this list, it looks like a list of problems, issues, and dysfunction. But perhaps there's another way to look at them. Perhaps there's a flip side to the coin. And when we can look at them through a different lens, they can be beneficial in a way. So difficulty with self-regulation. So both ADHD and creative people have this difficulty, as well as difficulty with delaying and inhibiting responses. So obviously, there's a weakness to these traits. At the same time, we could also look at this way, that people who are ADHD and people who have creativity, they may not tend to do things in the typical way, in the so-called appropriate or conventional way. And they're not doing this on purpose. So a lot of people with ADHD, they grow up and they realize that they tend to do things differently and they're not able to regulate themselves according to what is appropriate behavior. And they may have low self-esteem because of that. They can't really help it, but it's because they're able to act differently and to think differently, come up with different responses. They're able to be uniquely creative. When you look at the next set of traits, slow processing speed, slow reaction time, slow at naming things, which both creative people and ADHD people tend to have, that these seem to come into conflict with the first two here, with difficulty with self-regulation, delaying, inhibiting responses. But they're actually not in conflict. So what slow processing speed, reaction time, and naming things refers to is being slow at being able to respond quickly in the accurate, appropriate way. So people who are creative in ADHD have difficulty with this. So some people with ADHD may move quickly and they can move impulsively, but that does not mean that they're going to give the so-called appropriate and accurate response quickly. And I say so-called because that's according to convention. Difficulty with processing speed, reaction time, and naming things is being able to do so according to convention. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. So when it comes to naming things, for example, if you ask people who are creative or who have ADHD, for instance, to name all the animals belonging to a certain kind of category, whether it be mammals or reptiles, they're going to be slower at this compared to neurotypical people. And the reason why is that they don't necessarily form the same kind of conventional categories and associations that neurotypical people do. And I'm not playing down neurotypical people. This is certainly an advantage in itself to be able to name things quickly and to react and process quickly according to what is deemed appropriate and accurate. On the other hand, these weaknesses that ADHD and creative people have also implies their strength because they don't necessarily have the ready-made associations that neurotypical people have in their heads, and thus they're not going to respond really quickly with those typical associations. They are able to be creative as a result. They're able to come up with their own personal connections or their own answers. First, I want to mention that what I have described in terms of symptoms of inattention, impulsivity, and neurological abnormalities, this does not mean that every person who's creative or every person who has ADHD has all these specific symptoms. It's just that there is a high tendency for these individuals to have these kind of symptoms. The second thing I want to mention is that, again, I don't want to downplay people who are so-called neurotypical. In fact, there really is no such thing as a neurotypical person in that everyone has their own quirks, first of all, and second of all, everyone has their own personality as well. And it's good to have a balance of people who may think conventionally with people who don't think conventionally. I think a healthy society would have a good balance between these two. And the third thing I want to mention about is that these traits in themselves are not beneficial. I think it's also important for someone who has ADHD to be able to cultivate themselves instead of trying to get rid of their impulsivity. For example, try to find a way to hone their impulsivity in such a way that allows them to realize their creativity. And it's also helpful for them to be able to balance their impulsivity with ways of keeping organized. So I just want to let you know, I'll be making more videos on ADHD soon, and I just want to give you a taste of what I'll be talking about. So first of all, if you have ADHD, you may be creative and not even know it. So I've been talking with a lot of ADHD individuals, and I was able to help them be able to discover the creative nature, even though may not even be aware of it. And because they're not aware of this creative nature, it has a really strong effect on their self-esteem and thus also their ability to realize their creativity. I'm also going to talk about a nuanced view of how ADHD people are creative, that there are ways that they are creative and ways that they may not be creative. And I also want to provide a nuanced view on the effects of ADHD medication on both helping and hindering the creativity of those with ADHD. I don't really believe in presenting a black and white view. I want to present a nuanced view with context that could be helpful to people. And finally, I'll be talking about how I treat ADHD as a clinician and what tools you could learn to use that will be able to help you with your ADHD and also with creativity, as well as some of the issues and difficulties that you may face as an ADHD individual. So if you want to take a look at these videos, you're welcome to subscribe and turn on a notification button so you know when they come on if you find this to be helpful. So thank you so much for watching.